We're delighted to welcome you back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. This session is supported by the Hawthornden Trust. It's our pleasure to present Tom Stoppard, a life Hermione Lee in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury. Tom Stoppard, one of the greatest living playwrights, is a towering and beloved literary figure, known for his dizzying narrative inventiveness and intense attention to language. He deftly deploys art, science, history, politics and philosophy in works that span a remarkable spectrum of literary genres: theatre, radio, film, TV, journalism and fiction. His most acclaimed creations, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, are dead. The Real Thing, Arcadia, The Coast of Utopia and Shakespeare in Love remain as fresh and moving as when they entranced their first audiences. British biographer, literary critic and academic, Hermione Lee's latest work, Tom Stoppard, A Life, weaves Stoppard's life and work together into a vivid, insightful and always riveting portrait of a remarkable man. In conversation with author Chandrahas Choudhury, Lee talks about his life and draws on a wealth of new materials and on her many conversations with Stoppard. Hermione Lee is a literary biographer and professor emeritus of English literature. Her publications include biographies of Virginia Woolf, Edith Wharton and Penelope Fitzgerald, books on Willa Cather, Elizabeth Bowen and Philip Roth, and books on life writing, biography, A Very Short Introduction and Body Parts, essays on life writing. Her biography of Tom Stoppard was published in October 2020 to great acclaim. In 2013, she was made a Dame for services to literary scholarship. Chandrahas Choudhury is the author of the novels Arzi the Dwarf, Clouds and Days of My China Dragon, and editor of the anthology India, A Traveller's Literary Companion. He's also a creative writing mentor at the University of Iowa's Summer Institute program and honorary distinguished professor at K.R. Mangalam University. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section. Please do remember to ask questions by typing it in the questions section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Stoppard, A Life, Hermione Lee in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury.
Hello to you all in Darbar Hall, and we are here today to discuss this amazing book written by Hermione, my guest here. Hermione, this is not the same as meeting in Jaipur, but I gather you were not able to make it all these years in person because you were writing this.
That's exactly right. It's a bit of a paradox, but I'm very thrilled to be here virtually. I just wish it was the real thing.
I'm sure if we deliver enough entertainment, they'll call us back again next year, and it will be a pleasure to chat with you again, because I found this enormously interesting as a writer to read, whenever I see a book as big as this, I know in my case it would take me 10 years to write a novel for 1,000 pages. And as a biographer, of course, some of your material is already in front of you, but there's so many decisions to make and so many kinds of things to gather, especially of someone with such an international life who's now 80. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit, since this is not your first biography, what was particular to the collection of materials for this one before you could get started? And do you
yes, it's such an interesting question because it's such a peculiar trade, writing biography. It's a mixture of sort of archaeology and detective work and all kinds of other activities which you do as an amateur, really. So putting together the variety of sources in the case of writing about not only a living person, but a person who is enormously well known and has many, many contacts and friends, and is a great letter writer, and is also a person poised between the paper and the digital age. So that obviously biographers of the future are going to have all kinds of problems with sources that, everybody writes emails and is on social media instead of writing letters. Tom Stoppard is a great hand letter writer. So there was a lot of material. A lot of the archive is in the Harry Ransom Centre at Texas. as are the archives of many British writers. And there you have the extraordinary sight of version after version after version of, as it might be, one page of Arcadia. So that's in itself very fascinating to see how the work evolved. And in his own hands and in the hands of some others, there are photographs and journals. And one of the most extraordinary sources that he allowed me to see were the letters that he had written to his mother weekly between 1948 and 1996, when she died. Every week he would write her a letter, and these letters she saved and eventually were returned to Tom Stoppard. They're all undated. They're pretty much all undated. So I spent about 2 months trying to date them and then putting them into the narrative. And this was an astonishing resource because he's writing to his mother, so he doesn't tell her everything. But he clearly wants to keep her in touch with his life. And so it's like a diary of what he's doing. The sources like that are an amazing thing to have for a biographer.
Well, for a lot of male writers, it's their father who's the main authority figure in their life and the main person they answer to, even when, in some cases, when the person in question has passed on. But this is not so in Stoppard's case. It's his mother, very clearly so. And it's his mother who makes all the decisions in his early life, as we find out from reading this, that means that his childhood is lived between the Czech world, Darjeeling, of all places, and then England.
Well, that's a very gripping story. And when I started out on this enterprise, Stoppard said to me, "You'll find I've had a very exciting life up to the age of 8." Which is not quite true, but it's certainly in itself very true, in that the family, as you've said, his father, Eugen Straussler, was the Jewish doctor at the Barter Hospital in Zlin, which is the big shoe firm, worldwide shoe firm, which had its own town and its own hospital. So he was born there in 1937. When the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, the family, like many other families, fled to Singapore. And then the Japanese invaded Singapore, and his father was killed in that attack. And the mother took her 2 little boys in terrible circumstances on a ship which she actually thought was going to Australia. So they might have ended up in Australia rather than India. But they went first to Nainital and then to Darjeeling, where his mother ran the Barter shoe shop in Darjeeling. And he and his brother were boarders at actually an American missionary school, Mount Hermon, in Darjeeling, where they spoke English all the time. And then his mother found out about her husband's death, and she remarried an Englishman called Ken Stoppard, who took the family to England. And so, as Stoppard put it, at the age of 8, I put on Englishness like a coat. And he became an English public school boy. But the period in Darjeeling is one that he looks back on, and he revisited it in the 1990s and has written an Indian play, of course, which started as a radio play in the native state and then became a stage play, Indian Ink. He has intense nostalgia for that period of his life. And he tells a wonderful story about the school, a moment at the school in Darjeeling where he's walking along the school corridor and there's a sort of bevel along the side of the wall, and he runs his finger along this edge, and he remembers feeling completely happy, completely secure, even though these terrible things have happened to him in his childhood. And I went to visit Darjeeling in the process of my research, and there was the school, and there was the corridor, and there was the edge along the corridor, and I ran my finger along it, and I thought, this is exactly what a biographer should be doing.
Yes, it's amazing to follow the tracks of a life, isn't it? I mean, one can follow the tracks of one's own life. We know that he goes back as well, but many of the things are not the same. But of course, when one is writing a book about someone else, it's a different kind of thrill.
Well, you follow the tracks in as far as you can. The biographer Richard Holmes once compared the biographer's task as being like going to the edge of the broken bridge in Avignon. You can look across to the further shore and you can get as close as you possibly can to it, but you can't quite get there because it's, after all, not your life, it's their life. So you are, of course, at the mercy of what the person chooses to tell you if they're living, what their friends and relations will tell you, and what you can find from the archive. And there are always going to be things you can't find. And one of the interesting things about working on Stoppard is that he himself has characters in his plays who are very rude about biography and very scathing about its limitations. The character in the Indian play, Mrs. Swan, the old lady, says to the sort of nosy would-be biographer, biography is the worst excuse for getting people wrong. And you can see in that play and in Arcadia also how the sleuth, the biographical sleuth, is always getting things wrong. So those are serious warnings to anyone writing Stoppard's biography.
It struck me looking at your books that although you've written several biographies, Woolf, Cather, Wharton, this is the first man and is the first person who's alive.
That is true, and also the first playwright. I've always been very interested in the theatre, but I have always written about fiction writers. And one of the extraordinary things about writing about someone like Stoppard is that he's always doing a number of things at once. He's writing a play, he's thinking about a radio play, he'll be writing a film script, he'll be seeing his plays through rehearsal, which is a very important part of his life. He'll be, giving lectures, he has an enormous social life. So I sometimes felt that the linear line on the page needed to be like a musical stave in order to do sort of 6 things at once. Whereas when you're writing about a novelist, I don't know about you, but normally novelists write a novel and then they write another novel and then they write another novel. They're not usually doing 20 things at once.
Yes, that's right. And I also felt the main sort of feeling I picked up off the pages was that throughout his life, Stoppard feels very lucky for 2 reasons. One, the early success kind of meant that he could more or less live and work on his own terms, even if he had financial worries at some point or the other. And the other bit is that moving to England and growing up in what was a very stable political system meant that he didn't have to face some of the troubles that other writers faced in the world in the 80s and 90s, including in the country in which he was born, the Czech Republic.
Yes, this is absolutely fundamental to his whole view of life. You're absolutely right to put that at the centre of it. So they escaped the Nazis. He and his brother and mother got out of Singapore alive. They didn't go back to Czechoslovakia, as it then was, to grow up under a communist regime. They got to England after the end of the bombing and at the end of the war. So with good reason has he often described his life as a charmed life or as a lucky life. And I think chance and luck, from the throwing of the coins in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, play a big part in his characters' lives. But increasingly, as time went by, he came to think, very seriously about this, in part in the 1970s, when he became very involved with Charter 77 and with the fate and the life of Václav Havel, who became a good friend to him, with the political prisoners in the Soviet Union, with the Soviet refuseniks, and later on with Belarus, the Free Company in Belarus. So very often he has worked in the interests of people who have not had what he has sometimes called his charmed life. And he has very often thought about what his alternative life would have been had he gone back or had he not gone to India and gone to England. And there's a play called Rock and Roll, which came out in 2006, in which the main character, Jan, who was originally going to be called Thomas, which was Tom's original name, does grow up in Czechoslovakia, does suffer under the restrictions of the Soviet regime, does have the kind of life that people like Havel were having in the 70s. So he's acutely aware of his own place in relation, and his own privilege actually in relation to that. And then later on, he became increasingly aware of the Jewish history of his family.
He does have a certain kind of spirit, but it was also clear to me reading the book, as a biographer of a writer, you have the pleasure or sometimes the peril of reading their juvenilia. And in his case, whatever bits you quote from his life as a journalist in his late teens and early 20s, it's clear he already has quite a lot of linguistic flair and a great command of tone and of sounding funny and interesting on the page.
Yes,
and
you can.
It also struck me that unlike most writers today, he gets to literature without a university degree or ever going to university. And it looks unusual now, but if you look at most of literary history, this was the usual way for writers. I mean, they were very rarely also fully trained in literature. They came to it through other paths, like writing for periodicals. So this is actually the current.
He's a natural writer, you can see it. He's got all that energy and fun and glee and wit and joy in words pouring out of him from the age of about 15 onwards. He leaves school. He didn't like his second English school very much. He found it dull. He leaves school before he takes A levels at 17. What were then the advanced exams, which he would take at 18, and he didn't do that. He went to work as a journalist in Bristol, and Bristol as a journalist, that was his university. That was where he started to write all kinds of things. And as you say, he had columns, he had squibs, he had reporting, he started to write plays. He was very ambitious. He thought to himself at that time that the way to get famous very quickly was to write a play, because it was much quicker than writing a novel. So he had the sort of cynical ambition of youth. and also, the theatre was a big deal in the 60s. So late 50s, 60s. So you can see him cutting his teeth. You can see him falling in love with the Bristol Old Vic, where Peter O'Toole was then the big star, became very friendly with Peter O'Toole, and full of energy and ambition and yeah, absolutely, definitely wanting to be a writer from very early on. I think he had some mixed feelings about me digging up all his early teenage columns and bits of journalism. But I think as my work went on over a period of about 6 years, I could see him becoming increasingly resigned to the fact that this early material was going to see the light of day. And actually, for the reader, for him it may be embarrassing, but for the reader it's fantastically interesting.
Well, then he writes Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and this becomes a big hit, and he has what he had always dreamt of. And I think it's impressive to see that he is very aware of his good luck, and that it could have been otherwise, and he keeps that feeling through the rest of his life. And there's not a lot that you dig out that reflects very badly on him for the next 50 years.
Yes, I think he's extraordinarily much loved and admired and respected in the theatre world, which, like all specialist environments, has its own levels of malice and backchat and gossip and so on. And it is remarkable to go, to explore that world and to find how well he is spoken of. He keeps his friends, and his friends and family speak very well of him. However, I did find a sort of steeliness in him and a kind of reserve. He's enormously charming. He's famous for his charm and for his good manners and for his kindness to people. And all that is the case. But I felt also that the charm could act as a kind of persuasion mechanism and also as a barrier. So I think ultimately, peculiarly, this very sociable, gregarious, public, famous person is also rather private, and you might even say rather shy, actually. I had a very interesting conversation with David Cornwell, alias John le Carré, who sadly just died. And David Cornwell and Tom Stoppard were very good friends and had worked together. And David Cornwell told me that he thought there was a kind of core of darkness or even sadness. Certainly he used the word darkness in Stoppard, and that he recognized this because he had it in himself, but it was not something that they talked about. And I think if you go back even to the very fizzy, jubilant, witty, dazzling early work, Rosencrantz and Jumpers and Travesties, you see very clearly that these plays are about loss and fear and bewilderment and helplessness and mortality, just as much as they are about the enormous pleasure and delight in brilliant situations and wit and language.
When you write a biography for a novelist, you can't go very far beyond sort of a few notes about editors and readers. But when you write a biography of playwright, you get into all the other arts in a way, isn't it? Music, stagecraft,
Sure.
acting. And there's some very interesting pages in your book about Stoppard's relationship with some of the major actors of his time, of which a point that struck me was that as a playwright, if you're well known, you can very often, when you write your characters, already begin to envisage the people who are going to play them, and this is a great help in sort of working
Yes.
out what they're going to say.
Yes, and I think that's right. That like other playwrights, actually, he would periodically collect around him people who worked with him more than once, and people he liked to have interpreting his plays. So the late Dinsdale Landon, a wonderful actor, Michael Kitson, Felicity Kendall, and perhaps supremely John Wood, a really astonishing actor, for whom I think the character of Henry Carr in Travesties was probably, I think he probably had John Wood in mind. He also worked repeatedly with Peter Wood, the director. So there was a kind of team, and then you find John Wood, for instance, appearing again in a remarkable performance as the older Houseman, the poet Houseman, in the play Invention of Love. So whether he's exactly writing with a particular actor in mind, perhaps he has to be freer than that, but certainly knowing that there's someone out there who's likely to be able to interpret this as he wants it is clearly a factor. And the other thing, as you rightly say, that if you're a novelist, you write your novel and that's it. You're sitting in your room on your own. After that, you go to literary festivals and you talk to people about your novel, but you're not in a room with other people who are interpreting your novel for you. And one of the key parts, and one thing he loves, is to be in the rehearsal room and talking to the actors and the director and building up a tactful relationship with the director. So he's not, as it were, interfering, but he's there as a source if people want him. And I had the very good luck while I was doing this work to sit in on rehearsals twice with revivals of the 50th anniversary revival of Rosencrantz and the revival of Travesties done by Patrick Marber, and then of two new plays, The Hard Problem and then Leopoldstadt last year. And it's very extraordinary to see Tom Stoppard in the room with his play and watching people interpret it, not least because he is open to changing things. I mean, 50 years on, watching him in rehearsal with Daniel Radcliffe playing Rosencrantz and David Laveau producing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he would be tweaking things. And he would say, oh, should we put in a couple more lines for Gertrude at this point? This is a set text in classrooms all over the world. And yet he doesn't think of it as a fixed entity. He thinks, as he often says, of theatre as an event and not a text, and he is willing to change things. He's got to do the changing, nobody else.
There's a point in we feel that he's already very knows that he is so, but suddenly comes up, he drifts into another world in which the parameters of fame are set to a completely different standard. And suddenly he's rubbing shoulders with Sean Connery and Steven Spielberg, writing, being offered screenplays, and sometimes getting very upset at how his work is cut up, chopped up, and messed around with. But there's some absolutely fascinating bits there. I never knew that writers could earn so much money from doing a day or two of work. And
yes, I'm not sure that all writers can.
yes. And I didn't know that Spielberg thought so highly of him and consulted him so much, even for projects on which he didn't have a writing credit.
Yes, I think Spielberg has hugely valued his input and his advice on a number of films where Stoppard hasn't had a credit because he's maybe written, a few lines. Or I think, as you know, many people get to work on the screenplay of a movie, and very often people will find that their input has disappeared or been overridden by another writer who's been brought in, and that's notorious. And although Stoppard has put his committed energies into his screenplays in the way that he would into a play, it's not ultimately the same experience for him, because you're not ultimately in control of it. And actually, some of the fiercest messages that I found from him in going through his archive were really quite cross messages about the way things were being altered further up the line by producers or the money men or whatever. And he fights his corner. You see him fighting his corner very strongly. For instance, a wonderful piece of work, I think, which was the television adaptation of Parade's End by Ford Madox Ford, which is one of the really extraordinary pieces of work in Stoppard's writing life. And he really fights his corner on things like, don't signpost everything, don't make things too clear, let there be some ambiguity. And it's, I think he finds it easier to spring surprises on his audiences and do ambiguity and tricks and verbal tricks in the theatre than he does in the film world, where things are always being ironed out and made sort of clod-hoppingly obvious.
There's lots of pop up at different times in the book. I was most interested in two in particular. Harold Pinter, who, among other things, I didn't realize that he was such a cricket fan and had a cricket team which he ran with such an iron hand. Yes. And perhaps even more interestingly, at least from Stoppard's point of view, because there's lots of doubles in Stoppard's work, twins and doubles. And it seems to me that he kind of thought of the Czech playwright Václav Havel as a sort of a person he could have been in another life. And from the 70s and 80s, he gets very interested in what's happening, especially because Havel is in jail. And
we could come back to Pinter, which is a very interesting friendship, but and a very good friendship. And Stoppard greatly admired Pinter, and likewise the other way around. But since you mentioned that sort of alter ego feeling about Havel, might I read a journal entry and a letter? This would only take a couple of minutes. So this is in 1970, so January 1977. Stoppard's working on a play called Professional Foul, which is indeed about the West's relationship with what's going on in Eastern Europe. And Havel has been arrested. And Stoppard is sitting in his grand house in England, and he writes this in his journal. Václav Havel, a playwright whose mother didn't marry into British democracy, has been charged with high treason. The minimum sentence is 15 years. The crime has been to plead for the fulfillment of basic human rights as defined by various international agreements subscribed to by the Czech government. It's very difficult to continue writing about this in a coherent way. One's responses crowd each other out. His Czechness and my qualified Havel-like predilections as a writer single him out from the battalion of persecuted writers on my conscience. I sit here in this beautiful room, surrounded by the commonplace luxuries of a successful writer, and can hardly bring my mind to bear on Havel's present surroundings and on his prospect, his mental state. Could I contemplate a life where all can be preserved by moral cowardice, lost by moral courage? This society is maligned and attacked for its shortcomings. It must seem like paradise to a Czech or Russian artist. And he goes on to talk about how he needs to write about that. And then a few years later, and I'll just add this as a short, brief coda, if I may. This is in 1984, when Havel by now is out of jail but under surveillance. Stoppard goes to take an honorary degree for him at the University of Toulouse, and he reads the speech that Havel would have made, which was published as Politics and Conscience. And that speech set impersonal systems of totalitarian power against the humanity of individuals, and recommended, this is Havel, politics as practical morality, as service to the truth, as essentially humanly measured care for our fellow humans. Stoppard read the speech and made some comments which he jotted down in note form. The last note was, all political questions are moral questions. Back home in England, a few weeks after this trip, he wrote to him, Stoppard wrote to Havel, I'm feeling rather conscious of you today for a very peculiar reason. I dreamt last night that I had been sent to jail, I don't know why, for 3 years. My dream was about my first day in jail. I was in a terrible despair about being there, and in my dream, hoped it was only a dream, but knew it wasn't. Then one of my children woke me up when he was going to school, and after the first moment of relief that I wasn't in jail, but merely in bed, I immediately thought of you, and how frightful it must have been when there was no possibility of waking up and finding yourself at home.
It's an amazing story. Of course, it has a happy ending. When in 1990 there's the Velvet Revolution, and he gets invited by Havel to, who is now the president of the new country. And I really enjoyed that paragraph because it appears that there's never been so many writers in any government as in this one. And even the Minister for Defense is a literary critic.
Yes, it's very funny. And they all turn up in London because, of course, they're all, you know, very keen on Thatcher. My enemy's enemy is my friend, you know. And that's one of the reasons why Stoppard himself was quite a devoted Thatcherite during the 80s, because of the relationship, because of the Cold War and the relationship what was happening in the countries that were freeing themselves. And yes, you get all these rather scruffy people turning up wearing a suit for the first time who actually are poets and, you know, Greek scholars and things. It's wonderful, marvelous. Doesn't last for that long. I think now it looks like a mirage. It looks like a lost dream.
Reading a book, I was reminded of why, even as a writer who writes novels as a vocation and reads novels for the same reason, why I enjoy reading literary biographies so much, because it sort of restores in another frame all the connections between art and life, and there's that unfolding scroll of how a writer makes his decisions for 30, 40, 50 years.
I'm very glad you said that, because I only write literary biography because I come to biography from being a teacher of literature and a literary critic. And the problem is always how you negotiate that relationship between the writer's life and the writer's work. And quite a lot of people, when they read the kinds of books that I write, sort of get fed up with reading about the work. They just want to get on with the story. And other readers really, really want to read about plays or the novels. And so you're always slightly caught in a double bind. In a way, you're writing for two different kinds of readers. But I don't mind that. I think it's quite nice to have a sort of, you know, to have something for everyone in a biography.
You've not only written biography, but about the art of biography as well. And it seems to me, as an outsider who's never worked in the form, that biography is going through a sort of golden age. You can find so many biographies on the bestseller list, on the shelves, so many people working in the form. But also, there's begun to be lots of writing about how to do biography as well. But always struck me as a quintessential amateur's art. Anyone who, anyone who likes thinking about people and how a life is made up should be able to understand how it's done. I don't know what you feel.
There's no school for biography. You don't learn how to do it. On the other hand, as you're doing it, you begin to realize that there are certain things that work and certain things that don't work, at least for you. I mean, yes, I wrote a little tiny book for Oxford University Press called A Very Short Introduction to Biography, in which I set up a sort of number of rules for biography, like it must be true, or it must tell the whole life, or one must know and then I knocked all the rules down like Skittles, because actually all the rules are there for breaking. I'm glad you said it was a golden age for biography. People keep saying biography is dead. Nobody wants to read these big books about human beings anymore. And so it's reassuring to hear that you don't think that. But I think what is happening to biography, and this is very fascinating to me, is that the form is changing a lot. And when I wrote about Virginia Woolf in the 90s, one of the things I wanted to do was to take on board her challenge to traditional, conventional biography, which she felt didn't, granite and rainbow didn't meet. The facts and the vision of the person were awkwardly compressed together. And she was resisting the sort of Victorian, somewhat hagiographical biography where you don't hear much about the person's faults or their childhood or their mistakes and so on, or indeed their inner self. So obviously psychoanalysis has made a huge difference to the writing of biography, but I think now people feel that they can experiment with this form, that it's not monolithic, that it's not set in stone. And so there are wonderful enterprises like writing the biography of 1 year in Shakespeare's life, or group biographies about a whole lot of people, or biographies of what Virginia Woolf would call obscure lives. So I think it is a free form, but it's one that is very interesting to think about. And my own attempt in my writing has been to make it as readable and as attractive to read as possible, even though the books are necessarily long, because I think biographers should be artful. I think they should write with art, as well as simply being craftspeople who, put a table together.
I remember something said in one of a character in one of Disraeli's novels, read no history, nothing but biography, for that is life without theory.
Well, it's a very interesting word to use, because in academic life, and I don't know if this is the same worldwide, but certainly in Anglo-American academic life, autobiography has been much theorized and much taught. Biography has been the black sheep of academic life, and people have obviously felt it's too impure, it's too muddled, it's too popular. It hasn't been deemed worthy of academic study or theorizing. I think that is changing.
Is there something in the last 9 or 10 years that you would like to share with readers that is in the field of biography, a book that has impressed you a lot and that you think should be more widely read?
I'm not sure about wanting things to be more widely read, but I certainly have my gurus, the people whose work continually inspires me. And one of those is my friend Jenny Uglow, whose books on the lunar men and on Gascon. I mean, Jenny has been to Jaipur, so the audiences, I'm sure, will know her. On Buick, wonderful books about, particularly about a certain kind of English history. And I think she's a remarkable writer. I've always been very inspired by Jean Strauss's book on Alice James, which I think is due for a revival, which is a brilliant stroke, which is to take the life of the sister of Henry James, the brilliant sister of Henry James, who wasn't well known, and to reconstruct her life as a life worth telling. So yeah, those will be two immediate examples for me of biographers who've inspired me.
Last question. Some readers must be wondering, if one wants to write a biography of a certain person, does the person have to approach you, or can you chase them? And for instance, in the case of Stoppard, were there any other candidates for this book?
He approached me and I agreed to do it. And I think that may have been partly because I think quite a few people had been writing to him saying, please, could I write your biography? And he had, as I said earlier, he had very mixed feelings about biography. But he was turning 80. I think he wanted to get his life sorted out. There had been a biography written about 15 years ago, which is it's been done from the available sources. It was not done with interviews with him. So there are different ways of going about it. If you're going to write about a living subject, yes, you can certainly write them a letter saying, "Dear sir, please can I write your biography?" But you may well expect not to get a reply.
Well, it's time for some questions from the audience, and I'm pleased to see there's some very involved ones by people who've read one or more of your books.
Great, good, thank you.
Ashish Matthew asks, while the authors you seem to have focused on previous to this are women, Virginia Woolf, a book which I loved, Elizabeth Bowen, Willa Cather, and others. Do you have a particular interest in the lives of women writers?
I do, but I am not. I'm not a writer who feels that I'm only allowed to write about women writers, obviously. But yes, I have had for a long time a huge interest in great women writers, including the book before this was an English novelist called Penelope Fitzgerald, who I think is a sort of quiet genius. And this was a book that I was asked to write by her family after she died. I had known her, and this was a wonderful enterprise for me because she was a woman who had a very brilliant childhood, very talented and brilliant family, the Knox family. She had married a rather unfortunate man. They had plunged into really impoverished and difficult circumstances. She was dealing with that, which included living on a barge on the Thames, which sank. She was bringing up 3 children under great difficulties. And so she was a born writer who didn't get started until she was almost 60. And it's quite a familiar quality of women writers' lives. Virginia Woolf didn't get started till her 30s, really. Edith Wharton, similarly. Quite a lot of women have obstructions or domestic lives or involvements that stop them writing early. It's the absolute opposite of Stoppard's life. It was very fascinating to go to someone who was completely free to do what he wanted. He got on with it. He started from the age of 17. My previous subject with this remarkable woman whose talents had run, as many women's talents do, like an underground river through her life, and then suddenly burst out in the middle of her life. So she never was a young writer in the way that Stoppard was. So that contrast to me is very, very fascinating.
Jessica asks, having given too much time to this biography, would you say you now know Stoppard even better than his mother? What insight of the person did you learn, and what surprised you about him the most?
I certainly don't know him better than his mother did. Yes, I think you know the subject of your biography. As I was saying earlier, you know them as well as you possibly can. You know them from what's available to you. But there are always going to be things you do not know about another person, even a person that you spent 6 years talking to and reading about and reading. There are going to be private, mysterious and elusive things. I think what not surprised me so much, what simply amazed me about the life was just this astonishing energy, this unstoppable flow of curiosity about the world, amazing acquisition of knowledge. You know, nobody else writes plays which combine chaos theory with 18th century landscape gardening, or quantum physics with Cold War spies. It's just astonishing what he yokes together, to use one of his phrases. I was, sometimes I was sort of running along to catch up with what he knew. So you have to go from sort of teaching yourself basic chaos theory to learning about the history of the Russian Revolution, to thinking about the translation of Greek poetry by the poet Hausmann. These areas of study which he himself spent many years acquiring and being fascinated by. For me, that was a great learning curve. So that was the thing that sort of took my breath away, I think. I didn't find, if the question really means, did you find any horrible, dark, ugly secrets which you then swept under the carpet of biography? The answer is no.
Yeah, I don't think that the question was that. So
no, it's a good question.
As one of his collaborators says, and you quote this in the book, he's the only writer I know seems completely happy. And as writers ourselves, we know how rare that is. Might I ask you, just before we end, there's lots of things you can put into a biography, including some pictures, but what you can't is an artifact, because books don't allow that. And is there something that you could show us, the audience, or something from Stoppard's life, handwriting, a manuscript page that would be nice?
Yes. So interesting, that thing about him being completely happy, because it's the opposite of what Cornwall said about this darkness in him. And that points to the kind of complexity of the character, by the way. I have a little notebook from him, which has very early versions of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern when he was first doing the work. I don't know if you can see that well enough, but you can see what things are, the early versions. If you go to the archive in the Harry Ransom Centre in Texas, there are a million such pages. You know, he will work for years on the writing till he gets it absolutely right. So that's one thing I wanted to show you. The other, which I find very touching, is his very first publication. It was a great thrill to him to be published by Faber, because he was a huge fan of T.S. Eliot, who was, of course, you know, running Faber. And this was a collected volume of stories. And there are 3 Stoppard stories in here. Introduction to New Writing. Here's the Stoppard page. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. So I love having this book. The very, very first book shape Stoppard publication.
All right, Hermione, this has been an absolute pleasure. We have now run out of time, but this was great fun. If you write quickly, we can do something about another book next year.
I'll try. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Hermione Lee and Chandrahas Choudhury, for such a wonderful conversation. We thank the Hawthornden Trust for supporting this session. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Do stay logged on and continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring an amazing list of speakers. These all have been specially curated for you. Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 is protected by Dettol.
Kesariya